The screaming tore through the mansion at exactly 3 in the morning, sharp and relentless, echoing down the long marble corridors like an alarm no system could silence. Adrian Vale woke instantly, his heart pounding before his thoughts could catch up, a cold knot forming in his chest as the sound registered not as danger from the outside world, but from within his own walls. His children. He sat upright in the vast bed that suddenly felt absurdly empty, listening for a second, hoping the cries would fade, hoping it was just a bad dream passing through the house. Instead, the screams intensified, overlapping and uneven, filled with terror rather than pain. Adrian swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the chill of the floor biting into his feet as he stood, pulling on a robe he didn't bother tying. The mansion, built to impress and intimidate, now felt like an obstacle course of distance and regret. As he moved quickly through the hallway, past abstract art worth more than most homes and doors that led to rooms he rarely used, fragments of memory surfaced uninvited. Board meetings that ran late, flights taken instead of bedtime stories, quick kisses on foreheads delivered while checking emails. The children's wing was at the far end of the house, a deliberate design choice once justified as privacy, now exposed as foolishness. The screams faltered briefly, replaced by panicked sobs and a strange low sound Adrian couldn't identify, rhythmic and unsettling. Light flickered beneath the nursery door, not steady like a lamp, but dancing, alive. His pace slowed, anger bubbling up to mask the fear. He thought of the nanny, of rules and boundaries, of trust placed carefully and withdrawn even faster. His hand clenched into a fist as he reached the door, ready to confront whatever negligence or madness he was about to find. He pushed it open abruptly, prepared to shout, to take control the way he always did. What he saw stopped him cold. The nursery looked nothing like it had an hour earlier. The overhead lights were off, replaced by dozens of small candles lining shelves and the floor in careful patterns, their flames trembling and casting shadows that moved like living things along the walls. The air carried a faint scent of lavender mixed with something sharper, metallic, unfamiliar. In the center of the room, the nanny knelt barefoot on the rug, sleeves rolled up, her posture grounded and calm, as if chaos had never entered this space. His twins sat upright in their beds, eyes wide and red-rimmed, clutching stuffed animals to their chests, tears streaking down their cheeks, but no longer screaming. In the nanny's hands was a small device Adrian had never seen before, smooth and compact, thin wires extending to soft pads attached to the children's wrists. She was speaking to them in a low, steady voice, not words he could fully catch, but a rhythm that seemed to guide their breathing. For a moment, no one noticed him. He stood there, stunned, anger draining away into confusion. When the nanny finally looked up, surprise flickered across her face, but not guilt, not fear. She looked almost relieved, as if his arrival had been expected. Adrian's instincts clashed violently, years of control screaming that something was wrong, while another, quieter part of him noticed details he couldn't ignore, the children's chests rising and falling more slowly, their trembling easing, the way his daughter's fingers were wrapped tightly around the nanny's hand, as if letting go would bring the fear back. "What is this?" Adrian demanded, his voice loud in the candlelit room, harsher than he intended. The sound made his son flinch. The nanny immediately lowered her voice further, adjusting the device gently before answering. "They were having night terrors," she said calmly. "Severe ones." Adrian stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room, the candles, the wires, the unfamiliar device. "You didn't wake me," he said sharply, grasping for authority. She met his gaze steadily. "I tried," she replied, not defensive, simply factual. The words hit him harder than any accusation. He knew it was possible. He slept through calls all the time, trained himself to. His daughter whimpered softly, her breathing hitching again, and the nanny immediately squeezed her hand, murmuring reassurance. Adrian watched, unsettled by how instinctive the gesture was, how naturally his child leaned into her. "This isn't approved," he said, though the words sounded weak even to him. "You can't just do this." The nanny nodded once. "I know," she said, but nothing else was helping. "They wake like this almost every night. Tonight, they couldn't come back down." Silence filled the room, heavy and thick, broken only by the quiet crackle of candle flames and the slow, guided breathing of the children. Adrian looked at his son, at the tear tracks on his face, at the fear still lingering in his eyes despite the calm returning to his body. For the first time, a thought cut through his defensiveness with painful clarity. This had been happening without him, night after night. While he slept, while he traveled, while he built an empire that suddenly felt very small. He realized he didn't know what 3 in the morning sounded like in his own house, didn't know what his children needed when the world went dark and frightening. And standing there, surrounded by flickering light and quiet courage he hadn't expected to find, Adrian felt the first crack in the armor he had worn for years, a crack wide enough for guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to humility to seep in. Adrian stepped fully into the nursery and closed the door behind him with deliberate care, the soft click sounding louder than it should have in the candlelit stillness. His presence seemed to shift the air. The children's eyes flicked toward him, searching his face as if trying to decide whether he was part of the safety or another source of fear. He forced his expression to soften, something that did not come naturally to him in moments of stress. He moved closer to the beds, crouching slightly so he was at their level, his attention split between the twins and the strange device still resting against their wrists. The nanny rose slowly from the floor, giving him space without stepping too far away, as though she understood that pulling back too quickly might unravel what little calm had been achieved. "I want you to take those off," Adrian said quietly, nodding toward the device, his voice controlled but firm. The nanny hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then shook her head. "If I remove them too fast, their heart rate could spike again," she explained. "Give it a minute." The instinct to argue flared, but something in her certainty, in the way she watched the children rather than him, made him pause. He looked down at his daughter, whose small shoulders were finally no longer shaking, and he nodded once. The nanny slowly detached the pads, one at a time, murmuring reassurance as she did. The children's breathing remained steady, their eyelids drooping with exhaustion. Adrian let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on his son's back, feeling the warmth through the thin fabric of his pajamas. The simple contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, a reminder of how rarely he touched them like this, without an agenda or a schedule pressing in. "What caused it?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The nanny glanced at him, then at the children. "It's not one thing," she said. "It builds. Loud days, long separations, tension they don't know how to name. Their minds carry it into sleep." Her words were careful, but each one felt like a mirror held up to his life. Adrian straightened slightly, a familiar defensiveness creeping in. "They have everything," he said. "The best doctors, the best schools, anything they want." She nodded gently. "Yes," she agreed. "But they want you when they're afraid." The sentence landed with devastating simplicity. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, to justify, to explain the demands of his work, but no argument came. He looked at his children again and saw, with painful clarity, the distance money had not bridged. He gestured toward the candles lining the room. "And this?" he asked. "What is this supposed to do?" The nanny began extinguishing them one by one as she spoke, her movements slow and intentional. "The light gives their fear a shape," she said. "Something to focus on. When fear stays invisible, it grows." As the flames disappeared, the shadows retreated, and the room began to look like a nursery again rather than a ritual space. Adrian watched her, struck by how deliberate everything she did was, how nothing felt random or reckless despite his initial assumptions. When the last candle was out, the only light came from the soft bedside lamps, warm and ordinary. The children had sunk back against their pillows, eyes closed now, breaths deep and even. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle them, and brushed a strand of hair away from his daughter's forehead. She stirred slightly, then relaxed, her small hand curling instinctively around his finger. The gesture hit him harder than any accusation ever could. He stayed still, afraid that moving would break the moment. Behind him, the nanny gathered the device and placed it neatly into her bag, her movements quiet, almost reverent. "You should have told me," Adrian said at last, his voice lower, stripped of its edge. She paused, then turned to face him. "I tried to find the right time," she said. "But you're always in motion. Nights are when they need the most help." He nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of it. He thought of all the nights he had spent in hotels, the ceiling lights unfamiliar, his phone glowing with emails while his children slept, or didn't, miles away. If something had gone wrong, he began. She met his gaze without flinching. Then I would have taken responsibility, she said. But I wouldn't have done this if I wasn't sure it would help. There was no arrogance in her tone, only conviction. Adrian studied her face, seeing not recklessness but a kind of courage he rarely encountered, the quiet kind that didn't announce itself. He stood and moved toward the window, looking out over the dark grounds of his estate, acres of manicured land that suddenly felt irrelevant. Stay, he said without turning around. For now. Relief softened her posture, though she kept her composure. Of course, she replied. Adrian remained by the window for a long moment, listening to the steady breathing behind him, feeling the weight of a realization he could no longer avoid. Whatever success he had built outside these walls had come at a cost he was only just beginning to understand. The night stretched on in a strange, fragile calm, the kind that feels borrowed rather than earned, and Adrian found himself unable to leave the nursery even after the tension had drained from the room. He lowered himself into the armchair near the window, the leather cool beneath his palms, and sat watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his children's chests. Each breath felt like a small victory, and with every passing minute the reality of what he had almost missed pressed heavier on his chest. The nanny remained nearby, seated quietly on the rug, her back against the wall, giving him space while never fully disengaging. The silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, broken only by the distant hum of the house's systems and the occasional soft sigh from one of the children as they shifted in their sleep. Adrian's eyes kept drifting to the small device now resting in the nanny's bag, and curiosity began to replace suspicion. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked eventually, his voice low, careful not to wake the children. She looked up, surprised by the question, then considered it. "From my grandmother," she said. "She worked with children who had been through frightening experiences. She taught me that fear lives in the body as much as in the mind." Adrian absorbed this, thinking of the therapists he had hired, the clinical language they used, the charts and diagnoses that never quite captured what he saw in his children's eyes at night. "And you trust it that much?" he asked. She nodded. "I've seen it work when nothing else did." The conviction in her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, and Adrian found himself respecting it. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his temples, exhaustion finally catching up to him now that adrenaline no longer held him upright. "They never tell me," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "About the bad dreams." The nanny's gaze softened. "They don't want to worry you," she said. "They know you carry heavy things." The words cut deep because they were spoken without accusation. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, images flashing behind his lids, his children watching him leave with a suitcase, their small faces trying to look brave, the promises he made to come back soon. He had believed providing for them was the highest form of love. Sitting there now, he wondered how much fear had grown in the spaces he left behind. One of the twins stirred, letting out a small, distressed sound, and Adrian was on his feet instantly, moving to the bedside with a speed that surprised him. He placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder, murmuring reassurance the way he'd seen the nanny do earlier. The child's breathing faltered for a moment, then settled, his body relaxing under Adrian's touch. The nanny watched quietly, a faint, approving smile touching her lips. "You see," she whispered. "They feel you." Adrian swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. He remained by the bed, one hand resting lightly on the blanket, reluctant to pull away. Time seemed to move differently in that room, stretching and compressing in odd ways, until the darkness outside the window began to thin, the sky shifting from black to deep blue. Dawn was approaching. Adrian realized he hadn't slept at all, yet he didn't feel the usual fog of fatigue. Instead, there was a strange clarity, as if something essential had finally snapped into focus. He turned to the nanny. "Show me," he said quietly. She frowned slightly, uncertain. "Show you what?" "Everything you did," he replied. "The breathing, the grounding, the device. I don't want to stand outside this anymore." For a moment, she studied his face, as if weighing the sincerity of his request. Then she nodded. "All right," she said, "but it takes patience." Adrian gave a short, humorless laugh. "I have to learn," he said. She moved closer and explained in a hushed voice, demonstrating with her own breathing, showing him how to slow it, how to match it to a child's rhythm. He followed, awkward at first, then more naturally, surprised by how calming the simple act felt. She described how the device worked, not as a cure but as a guide, helping the body remember safety. Adrian listened intently, committing each detail to memory as if it were a contract he couldn't afford to misunderstand. As the first light of morning spilled into the room, illuminating the children's peaceful faces, Adrian felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He knew this night would mark a turning point, not because of fear or confrontation, but because of presence. For the first time in years, he hadn't delegated the hardest moment to someone else. He had stayed, and in staying, he had begun to understand what his children had been asking for all along, not with words, but with screams in the dark that finally reached him. Morning arrived gently, as if the house itself understood that loudness would be an intrusion after the night they had survived. Pale sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the nursery, laying soft bands of gold across the floor and the walls, and Adrian remained still in the armchair, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace that had settled there. His children slept on, their faces relaxed in a way he had not seen in months, free of the tightness that usually lingered even in rest. He realized then that this was the first dawn he had witnessed from this room since they were infants, and the thought carried both warmth and a sharp edge of regret. The nanny stood near the window, her silhouette outlined by the light, waiting without impatience, as though she understood that something important was unfolding inside him. When Adrian finally stood, his joints stiff and his body heavy with sleeplessness, he felt an unexpected steadiness beneath the fatigue. He crossed to the beds one last time, brushing his fingers lightly over each child's hair, memorizing the sensation, the warmth, the reality of them. "I'm here," he whispered, though they could not hear him, and perhaps the words were meant more for himself than for them. He turned to the nanny and nodded, a gesture that carried more meaning than any formal thanks. "You didn't just help them," he said quietly. "You showed me what I've been missing." She inclined her head, accepting the words without triumph. "They need you," she replied simply. Adrian exhaled, the truth of it settling deep. Later that morning, as the household began to wake, routines resumed cautiously, as if everyone sensed the shift. Adrian canceled meetings without explanation, silenced his phone, and stayed close as his children woke naturally, confusion giving way to smiles when they saw him there. He helped with breakfast, listening to their small voices describe dreams that were no longer frightening, their words tentative but hopeful. Each laugh felt like a fragile gift. The nanny moved through the background, attentive but no longer alone in carrying the weight. Adrian found himself watching her with a new respect, understanding now that trust was not a resource to be rationed but a bridge to be built. When the children went out into the garden later, chasing sunlight instead of shadows, Adrian and the nanny stood side by side, observing quietly. "I want this to change," Adrian said at last. "Not just last night. Everything." She met his gaze, searching for the familiar evasions of powerful men, and found none. "Then it will," she said, "if you stay." The words echoed long after she returned to her duties. In the days that followed, the mansion felt different, less like a monument and more like a home in the making. Nights grew quieter. When fear did surface, Adrian was there, sitting at the edge of the bed, breathing with his children, reminding them with his presence that they were safe. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to be still, how to listen, how to prioritize moments that could not be scheduled. The nanny remained, not as a secret guardian in the dark, but as a partner in care, her role acknowledged and respected. Adrian understood now that wealth had never been the answer to his children's cries. What they needed had always been within reach, waiting for him to stop running long enough to hear them. And sometimes, he reflected, it took a scream in the middle of the night to wake a man to the life he was already living.